the Metropolitan Police have said about the reforms that they will be looking at, I think is absolutely right. We need to also be looking at what more government can do to help build that confidence.
After days of queuing at the pumps, the Army will begin delivering fuel to petrol stations across the UK from Monday. The Queen has officially opened the 6th session of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood this morning. And provisional clinical trial results suggest that the experimental drug for severe COVID cuts the risk of hospitalisation or death by about half. 2 new streams of lava pose a further threat of destruction as the La Palma volcano forces thousands more to flee the island. Hello, and whether you're watching the UK or anywhere else around the world, welcome to BBC News. The UK Home Secretary, Britain's Interior Minister, has said police must raise the bar by taking the harassment of women more seriously. Priti Patel said crimes such as flashing and verbal abuse shouldn't be taken lightly. She said women should feel confident to call out such offences. Ministers have promised reform to the criminal justice system following the murder of Sarah Everard. She was raped and killed by a serving police officer. Simon Jones reports.
The death of Sarah Everard prompted an outpouring of public grief. Now the government says it's determined her murder will bring about permanent change in how society deals with violence against women and girls. The Prime Minister says there are too few prosecutions and convictions for sexual violence.
The time from report to referral, from referral to the court proceedings, from court proceedings to the conclusion, all 3 of those segments is far too long. And what you're seeing is the whole system snarled up with evidential problems, with data issues, with mobile phones disclosure, all that kind of stuff. And it's a nightmare for the women concerned.
Wayne Couzens kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He then dumped her body in Woodland in Kent. Cars registered to him had previously been linked to 2 allegations of indecent exposure, but he wasn't identified as a potential sex offender. It's claimed Couzens also used a WhatsApp group to swap misogynistic messages with officers from the Metropolitan Police, the Civil Nuclear Constabulary and the Norfolk Constabulary.
We've also got to address the issues going on within the police force, and you'll have seen this stuff about the officers on the WhatsApp group. We've got to come down very hard on them.
The Home Secretary says the police must raise the bar by taking harassment and flashing more seriously. Priti Patel told The Telegraph they should not be considered low-level crimes. The Met says it's putting more officers in places where people feel unsafe.
We're absolutely committed to tackling violence against women and girls, and that is going to be one of our focus. It is one of our priorities. So you will see us out on patrol in hotspots.
But there are calls for more scrutiny of the police themselves.
This has been going on for many, many years, and I'm rather tired of hearing police forces saying we're going to learn lessons from some tragedy. The lessons don't seem to be learned, and the lessons are that women's suffering of this kind of stuff has to stop, and women up and down the country are saying that. And you have to listen, and police forces are not doing that. And so it has to be listened at a lower level, and I'm sorry, that means resourcing, and that means more police available and more money put into policing and into the court system. But we also have to have much better processes of training police and those in the justice system.
Opposition politicians accuse the government of starving the police and courts of resources. But there's a growing consensus that the death of Sarah Everard must act as a watershed moment. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Well, earlier our political correspondent Oni Wells came into the studio and she told me ministers are under increasing pressure, putting increasing pressure on the police to deal with violence against women and young girls.
I mean, there's certainly huge public and political pressure that's now growing on the Metropolitan Police in particular, particularly around this question of whether they could have done more to prevent a serving police officer from murdering Sarah Everard, not least because it has now emerged that he has been linked to 2 previous cases of allegations of indecent exposure, but also allegations of exchanging misogynistic WhatsApp messages with other police officers as well. So those questions now very much kind of facing the Metropolitan Police. And earlier, as you say, the Health Secretary Secretary, former Home Secretary Sajid Javid, did say that both the government and the police needed to look at reforms about what could be done to try and stop something like this happening again.
The Metropolitan Police have said about the reforms that they will be looking at, I think is absolutely right. We need to also be looking at what more government can do to help build that confidence, building on the violence against women and girls strategy that was published in the summer. This is obviously an appalling, shocking case, and we must make sure that at least something that comes out of this is that we can give more confidence to more women about their own safety.
We've heard there, obviously, the Health Secretary calling for some kind of reform into what has happened, but there are some on the opposition particularly calling for something a bit more specific. We've had people like the Labour MP and Chair of the Home Affairs Committee, Yvette Cooper, for example, say that Metropolitan Police issuing apologies just isn't enough, and they have been calling for a specific inquiry, not just into what happened in this specific case, but also into the wider culture within the police force as well.
We obviously, 25 years ago or more now, had the inquiry into the killing of Stephen Lawrence, and that led to a finding of institutional racism. Is there a concern politically that we may be looking at a question of institutional misogyny that's become built into the DNA of some parts of the police service?
Well, that's certainly an allegation that has been put forward by people across the political spectrum, really. And it's interesting to note that even people like the Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse himself, has said that the police will need to work a lot harder to restore confidence and trust now in the police force. And this is trust, I think, on quite a number of levels here. This is trust not only in the fact that if a police officer stops an individual, like they did with Sarah Everard, that police officer won't do somebody harm. It's trust that the police will root out any misconduct within its own force, as you mentioned, given what we've seen and what has now emerged about these alleged WhatsApp messages between other police officers exchanging misogynistic comments as well, but also trust that they will make sure that nothing like this happens again, that any kind of vetting that is done roots out any problematic behaviour, as we have seen in this, that was the case with this individual.
Arnie Wells there. The Army will begin delivering fuel to forecourts from Monday to try to ease the pressure at petrol stations. Ministers are also allowing up to 300 of the 5,000 HGV drivers being recruited from abroad to come to this country immediately. The government says the rest will arrive later in October. Our political correspondent Pete Saul reports.
We started to see scenes like this in parts of the UK last weekend. Frustrated drivers desperately trying to fill up. And now the government is calling in the military. Some service personnel will be out providing support today. And from Monday, soldiers will be driving petrol tankers themselves. So why has it taken so long?
Well, first of all, you're asking military personnel who are trained to drive tankers cross country to take tankers full of highly inflammable liquids into built-up areas onto forecourts where you and I fill up our cars. And it has to be the case that we make sure they get the appropriate training to do so. I think we would all expect that to be the right thing. And at the same time, we have to work with industry so that we know where we're sending them. We can't just send them to random garages. It has to be properly deployed.
As well as the support from the armed forces, more drivers will be allowed into the UK from overseas. A new scheme will enable up to 300 tanker drivers to come and work here immediately. Haulage firms will find potential recruits and apply to the government for licences. Up to 4,700 lorry drivers specialising in food delivery will start to arrive from the end of this month. This temporary visa scheme has been extended until the end of February. And 5,500 poultry workers will be granted the right to work here too until the end of the year. Ministers hope these measures, along with efforts to recruit more British staff, will address some of the problems in the supply chain. But there could still be a tough winter ahead. Peter Saul, BBC News.
Well, Brian Madison from the Independent Petrol Retailers Association joined me earlier and described the situation out on the roads this morning.
We're seeing from our poll this morning much the same as yesterday, an improving situation from the Midlands through the north and into Scotland, but in fact a worsening situation in London, South East and parts of East England. So what we've been asking our government, and I've had a long conversation with Grant Shapps this morning, it's very good. Government are talking closely to industry about the problems. And what I've asked him is that the prioritisation for deliveries must now go to London and the South East, and to the independent forecourts, which make up 65% of all forecourts across the UK. If your local filling station doesn't have fuel, and then you travel further and find yet more filling stations without fuel, then consumer confidence is going to remain at the low end.
Brian Madison. There could be a breakthrough in the way we treat COVID-19. Interim trials suggest a new experimental drug could cut the risk of hospitalisation or death by about half. If authorised by regulators, the treatment will be the first oral antiviral medication for COVID-19, as Mark Lebel explains.
This is the first COVID pill. Trial results suggest it can cut hospitalisations or deaths by half.
The news of the efficacy of this particular antiviral is obviously very good news. The company, when they briefed us last night, had mentioned that they will be submitting their data to the FDA imminently. The data are impressive.
Pills were given to 775 unvaccinated elderly or medically at-risk volunteers within 5 days of them showing coronavirus symptoms. The data from a phase 3 trial showed 7.3% of patients on the drug were hospitalised, compared to 14.1% of those who didn't take the tablets. 8 patients who were given a placebo or dummy pill later died of COVID, but there were no deaths in the group taking the pill. The trial was stopped early because the pill was so successful. The data still needs to be peer-reviewed. So how does it work? As coronavirus replicates itself inside your body, these antiviral pills trick it into using the drug, which then inserts errors into the virus's genetic code, blocking the virus from replicating.
It completely corrupts the genome of the virus so it can't replicate. And that's the beauty. And then even if the virus mutates, it could be still useful. People are now talking about this, that if we have another coronavirus pandemic in the future, this drug will still work for that coronavirus because it is agnostic to variants.
There are existing clinic-based intravenous treatments which are even more effective, but this appears to be the first pill to treat COVID and, as long as it's taken early on, could offer an alternative at roughly a third of the price, at $700 a treatment.
Accessibility is a problem with a monoclonal antibody. For this one, it's a simple pill, so obviously a lot easier to administer and a lot easier to administer as an outpatient as well.
Merck hopes 10 million courses of the treatment will be available by the end of the year. It has agreed to supply the US with close to 2 million and to license the drug to several India-based generic drug makers, which could supply it to low and middle-income countries.
For countries that don't have the vaccine available, this could be another stopgap.
The US authorities say the drug is no substitute for preventative vaccines, but this is an exciting development, as the US drug company seeks emergency approval within weeks, as the first company to report trial results of an effective and relatively cheap pill to treat COVID, as other companies also work on similar treatments. Mark Lobel, BBC News.
The number of deaths caused by COVID in the United States has now exceeded 700,000. That's according to Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, which collates figures worldwide. It's the highest number for any country, outstripping other badly affected nations like Brazil. The US is facing a further resurgence of cases due to the prominence of Delta variant. Now, the rollout of third doses of COVID vaccine for vulnerable people with weak immune systems has gone badly wrong, according to 2 British charities. Kidney Care UK and Blood Cancer UK say many people are still struggling to access their third jab a month after it was recommended by the vaccine experts, the JCVI. NHS England says eligible patients should be offered the injection by the end of next week. Steve Harrison is among those still waiting.
I just think it's been pretty terrible all the way through, really, with the communication right from the very beginning. It's made a lot of patients quite anxious and angry because without this, we're kind of almost shielding again.
Vaccine passports came into effect for the first time in Scotland on Friday night. People need proof of vaccination to gain entry to nightclubs or large events. The scheme is mandatory from now, but the Scottish Government announced earlier this week that it won't enforce it until the 18th of October. A judge rejected a challenge to the rollout by the nightclub industry earlier. The launch of the app associated with the vaccine passport has been hit by technical problems.
We've ultimately made a decision as a society to respect people who don't want to get vaccinated. I think that's why it's a little bit disappointing, even though myself I'm double vaccinated, that there isn't an option for people who don't want to get vaccinated. We're not sort of respecting their opinions by being able to submit a negative lateral flow and then still being able to go to a nightclub. We're saying effectively, don't come.
Right, it is 12:15. Let's take a look at the headlines on BBC News. And the Home Secretary says police must raise the bar by taking the harassment of women more seriously. After days of queuing at the pumps, the Army will begin delivering fuel to petrol stations across the UK from Monday. And provisional clinical trial results suggest an experimental drug for severe COVID cuts the risk of hospitalisation or death by about half. Don't be alarmed if you're anywhere else in the world. It is only 12:15 in the UK. Now, the President of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, has said he's retiring from politics. He'd been offered the chance to run as Vice President in the election next May because the Constitution bars him from a second term as President. He won originally in 2016 on a platform of crushing crime and fixing the country's drugs crisis, but critics say he has encouraged police to engage in extrajudicial killings. The decision potentially clears the way for his daughter, Sara Duterte Carpio, to contest the presidency instead. Taiwan has accused China of wanton aggression after an unprecedented number of Chinese military aircraft crossed into its air defence zone Friday. The island's Prime Minister said China had damaged regional peace while engaging in bullying acts. Taiwan says it scrambled combat planes to warn off 38 Chinese military aircraft which entered the zone in 2 waves on Friday, China's National Day. Beijing sees Taiwan as a breakaway province and has been stepping up pressure on the island to accept Chinese sovereignty. The volcano, which has been erupting for the past 11 days on the Spanish island of La Palma, is spewing out 2 new streams of lava, threatening further destruction. Many homes and crops have been destroyed. Thousands of people have been forced to evacuate since the eruption first began last month. Dan Johnson reports from the island.
This volcano is still really active, and there is fresh lava flowing from new vents that have opened up. And that means other homes, other villages are potentially at risk. More than 6,000 people now have been evacuated and are staying with friends and family or in emergency shelters. And we saw people today making the decision now that it's time for them to leave, to get to somewhere safe, because they've lived with this for over 11 days now, and some people are just fed up. They've had enough and they want to get to a safe place. More than 1,000 properties have been destroyed, and this is having a really big impact, not just on daily life here, but on people's livelihoods. I was talking to a fisherman in the harbour who can't go out to sea because there's such a big exclusion zone around the area where the lava is pouring off the land into the water and setting hard. It's actually creating new land. La Palma is growing, but it's such a destructive process, and the fisherman thought he may not have a future here in that industry. He may leave La Palma and potentially never return. So even before it's ended, the impacts of this eruption are wide-ranging and long-lasting. And what nobody knows is just how long it's going to go on. So for now, the volcano keeps erupting, the lava keeps flowing, and it's unpredictable. Where is it going to go, and how much more damage will it do? Dan Johnson, BBC News on La Palma.
Slide to phone-ins with pop stars. Saturday Morning Kids TV has been entertaining children for decades. In fact, for 4.5 decades. It all began on the BBC 45 years ago today, when Noel Edmonds, remember him, first presented the multicoloured swap shop, and though presenters and programmes have changed through the years, it's continually kept youngsters amused. Well, I'm pleased to join by one of those veterans of Saturday morning television, the Saturday Aardvark presenter, Kirsten O'Brien. Kirsten, good morning to you. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you.
Dare I ask whether you miss getting up on Saturday mornings? Because presumably you used to get up very, very early to be bright and breezy by this time of the day.
You know, I was a lot younger then, and I've had kids in, so I'm used to much harsher wake-ups these days.
I mean, what do you think is special about Saturday mornings for kids?
Well, I think they're booting about, and again, having my own now, they're booting about, they don't have to go to school. They're looking for something to do. And that was the joy back then of all your favourite bands used to be on Saturday morning telly. So you could see your absolute key favourite people were on, whether it be, you know, like they'd interview pop stars, whether it be film stars, everything was happening there and then. And as a kid, you could just sit down and go, oh my gosh. And as a presenter for me, I got to meet everybody. It was incredible.
Now, Swap Shop, as it gradually became known, the multicoloured bit seemed to drop off the title after a couple of years. Back in 1976 it started. It had its own kind of purple dinosaur figure, but he wasn't really interacting with the presenter. By the time we get to the Saturday Aardvark, the dare I admit it, puppet is getting equal billing. I just wondered what that was like.
It's not even equal billing, it's his own show, really, isn't it? I'm the sidekick. I'm the sidekick by then. Yes, Otis was an absolute legend of a pupper, and I had so many laughs. What we would quite often do is we rehearse for the studio, the cameras, the director, and then we'd say to ourselves, it's not going to be like that when we go live. And we had that joy because it's live. It was just mayhem. And as long as you're not swearing or being too rude, it's a real playground. And that's why you get so many presenters like Philip Schofield and everything that go on to do great things, because you learn so much in that environment of how to be a presenter. I mean, it's interesting what you say, because what we do in news is generally quite controlled. He says famous last words. That's guaranteed something's going to go wrong now, isn't it? But from live children's TV, apart from working with children and quite often animals, the two things that actors are told never to do, you are dealing with a very unpredictable environment, aren't you? Often where a lot of the script will just say ad lib, ad lib, ad lib. Yeah, I always used to have a pile of kids' pictures just out of shot, because the number of times a programme would either go down or some sort of, it would freeze, a technical problem, particularly back in the days where it was very manual. It was person pressing a button or going, the tape's not even here. It was always, I've got 50 kids' pictures to show now. And I travelled on with that. I never now do I do live radio or anything without thinking, what's my backup if something goes wrong? So there is the training in action. Did you find there was a kind of a different atmosphere in the studio on a Saturday morning? Did everyone feel a bit more relaxed? Because my memory of TV back in certainly the 70s and 80s was that a lot of people in studios still wore ties and things like that. It still felt quite formal. I just wonder whether it felt a bit more relaxed. I mean, you were doing what in the 90s with Saturday Aardvark, whether things felt a bit more relaxed on a Saturday. We used to get a delivery of bacon butties and egg backs. And that got us going. I remember one time, in fact, talking of things going wrong, they came back to us early off the programme, and the guy that puppeteered Otis, the absolutely brilliant Dave Chapman, had a mouthful of sandwich at the time, and so Otis was having to mimic that, because Dave couldn't get his words out. So people were just happy to be there. It's a joyous environment, really, really lucky to work if you work Saturday mornings on such a big show like that. Well, Kirsten O'Brien, thank you so much for that, and thank you as well for celebrating the anniversary with us here on the BBC News channel, for all the lovely memories you've made for kids, and indeed some of the people who aren't kids, some of their parents too over the years. Lovely to speak to you. Thanks so much. Bye. Kirsten O'Brien there, marking 45 years of Saturday morning TV for kids. Now, the Queen and Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon have been addressing MSPs in the opening of the 6th session of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. Her Majesty spoke in the debating chamber where the SNP are starting their 4th consecutive term in government. This time, though, in an agreement with the Green Party following elections in May. The Queen spoke about the importance of the Scottish Parliament as the country moves towards a phase of recovery in the COVID pandemic.
The Scottish Parliament has been at the heart of Scotland's response to the pandemic, with people across this country looking to you for leadership and stewardship, and I hope you will remain at the forefront as we move towards a phase of recovery. While some of you will have differences of opinion, I trust you will continue to work together.
The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, said that despite disagreements between MSPs, she hoped they would find the resolve to reach consensus and common purpose for the benefit of all Scots.
There is, I believe, a desire across our country as we emerge from the trauma of the pandemic for a better, more hopeful approach to politics and to governance. At a time when the challenges facing Scotland and the world are so great, we cannot, must not, allow our responses to be small. The responsibility, therefore, indeed the duty of this 6th Scottish Parliament is to rise to that challenge, to lead our country out of crisis and towards a better future, and to do so with wisdom, compassion, justice, integrity and courage, to live up to those ideals on which this Parliament is founded, to discharge the calling you set out for us, Your Majesty, in your speech at our inaugural opening 22 years ago, when you counselled us to exercise wisdom in using the powers of this Parliament, and to serve, and serve well, all of the people of this land of ours, as we strive together to achieve our hopes for the marvellous, our hankering for a changed and a better life.
Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. Let me bring you some breaking news. This is regarding the Morrisons supermarket group in the UK. The takeover panel has agreed a bid by from Clayton, Dublin and Rice. You're watching BBC News. I should say Clayton, Dublier and Rice. They've won the auction for Morrisons. They, according to the takeover panel, which governs merger and acquisition agreements in the UK, they offered 287 pence a share during the course of a bidding process that's been taking place Saturday morning. It was the bid, in fact, that the board of Morrisons had already agreed unanimously in favour of that takeover, so they will be delighted by the outcome. And now time for a look at the weather. Here's Matt Taylor.
Hello. Certainly won't be a washout of a weekend, but a fairly soggy afternoon on the way for the vast majority. Rain at times, heaviest across some southern areas, but we will see the strongest of the winds confined to parts of the south and the east. Gales expected here. Tomorrow looking much brighter, mixture of sunshine and showers. By this stage, though, the strongest of the winds in the very far north of Scotland. Today's strong winds are the eastern edge of this developing low pressure system. That's going to scoot its way up to be in northern Scotland by tomorrow. But underneath it, as we've seen, various weather fronts combine. Plenty of rain around to take us through the afternoon. Dry start, though, across parts of eastern England, good part of Scotland, and drying up across parts of Northern Ireland after this morning's rain. A scattering of showers here, though, through the afternoon. Turning wetter central southern Scotland, maybe some parts of northeast England, southeast Scotland won't see the rain until late in the afternoon. Driest of all, far north of Scotland throughout today. A cool day, 11 to 15. Some lively showers, but a bit of sunshine in between into Wales and the southwest later. Winds lighter here than this morning, but the strongest of the winds this afternoon are on these southern coastal counties of England, right the way through into East Anglia, 40 to 60 mile an hour gusts, accompanied by heavy rain, some very unpleasant travelling conditions. Now, through this evening and overnight, strong winds, heavy rain across eastern areas to begin with. The strong winds remain in parts of Scotland as our area of low pressure works its way northwards. Elsewhere, we'll see some clearer skies, a scattering of showers in the west, and a bit of a fresh start to Sunday morning. Temperatures down into single figures for the vast majority. So the chart for Sunday shows that our low pressure will be centred by this stage, and it's around that we're going to see the strongest of the winds. But we're bringing in, again, fairly cool air mass coming in from the north and the west, with a mixture of sunshine and showers for the vast majority. Driest conditions to begin with, eastern areas. Some will stay dry all day long, although 1 or 2 showers possible into the afternoon as a breeze picks up here. Strongest the winds in the far north of Scotland, especially Shetland. We could see winds close to 60, maybe 70 miles an hour at times. And again, it will feel cool in the breeze, offset a little bit though, once you've got those longer, sunnier spells. And we will have some sunshine in London for the marathon. It's almost perfect running conditions, I think, for many. A few showers potentially later in the day as the breeze picks up. Much showery, though, for the Belfast Marathon, of course, which is also taking place. And then as we go through the rest of the week, be prepared for some more wet and windy weather potentially on Tuesday. Things turn drier and a little bit warmer, we think, later in the week. Bye for now.
As Scotland prepares to welcome world leaders to Glasgow for the major climate conference, COP26, we tackle some of the big and small questions about climate change. We'll be looking at why it matters to all of us and the impact it's already having here and around the world. And we'll be hearing from the people in Scotland leading the innovation and coming up with solutions to tackle this global issue.
Our Planet Now, Scotland Climate Change Special, streaming now on BBC iPlayer.
Political Thinking is the series in which I have conversations with those who shape our political thinking about what has shaped theirs, their backgrounds, their values, their lives beyond politics.
Political Thinking with Nick Robinson, tonight at 8:30 on the BBC News channel.
And you're watching BBC News with me, Sean Lay. The headlines this hour. The Home Secretary says police must raise the bar by taking the harassment of women more seriously. Thoughts echoed by Health Secretary Sajid Javid.
The Metropolitan Police have said about the reforms that they will be looking at, I think is absolutely right. We need to also be looking at what more government can do to help build that confidence.
After more than a week of queues at the pumps, the Army is to begin delivering fuel to petrol stations across the UK from Monday. The Queen has officially opened the 6th session of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. Provisional clinical trial results suggest an experimental drug for severe COVID cuts the risk of hospitalisation or death by about half. And 2 new streams of lava pose a further threat of destruction as the La Palma volcano forces thousands more to flee. And now on BBC News, it's time to join the team for Click.
This week, we're all about genetics. Should your DNA decide your dinner? How does it shape your personality? And can it be used to track down a murderer? It's the most personal data that you own. It literally defines you. It is your DNA. Ever since the human genome was decoded, researchers have been peering deeper into what makes us, us. And more companies have been able to build services around what they've found so far. Here's what Lara has to say on the subject.
Excuse me. It's not disgusting, it's science.
I think it's both, actually. Look forward to finding out what's got Lara spitting feathers later. But first...
Here we go again.
A story that will make your blood run cold. I'm in Iceland, revisiting the freezers at Decode Genetics in Reykjavik, where robots working in temperatures of minus 26 Celsius look after the blood of Iceland. Over the last quarter of a century, Icelanders have donated nearly 2 million samples, all in the name of genetic research.
If you want to know what minus 26 Celsius feels like, it's very painful on the ears. You really don't feel like breathing very hard at all. And weirdly, my nostril hairs are freezing up. Every time I do that, they're cracking.
Iceland has been scrupulously recording ancestry records for hundreds of years, so it kind of makes sense that it's also now at the forefront of research to try and identify the specific genes responsible for particular genetic diseases.
And what's amazing is the foresight. They gathered a lot of these blood samples before the science became possible to do the things they're now doing. So by gathering it and keeping it for 20 years, they can call back, they can go back to the older blood samples if they have new research techniques available.
By doing this, they've been able to identify genetic variations associated with many kinds of cancers, and they're now even able to estimate how long you have left to live based on levels of particular proteins in your blood.
The other fun thing about coming out of this temperature into normal temperature is what happens on cold glass. Condensation, lots and lots of condensation. And it doesn't stop forming. So that's it. Camera's written off for about an hour now.
And a bit later, once we've dried off and warmed up, I am going to blow your mind with a discovery researchers here have made that links your body shape to the way your mind works. In the meantime, in the US, James Clayton has been uncovering a different way in which ancestry data and DNA is now being combined to solve murders.
The suburbs of Fort Worth in Texas are quiet, sleepy. I'm here to visit the brother of Carla Walker, a teenager who was abducted and brutally murdered in 1974, over 4 decades ago.
I have memories, especially of Carla, sitting out here talking to girlfriends. She and my sister Cindy shared this large room on the 2nd floor.
And that's where she lived when she was abducted?
That is correct, yeah.
Her younger brother Jim remembers the day clearly.
Carla had her pretty dress on and Rodney was looking quite nice in a suit. And we took pictures in front of the fireplace and off they went. We searched for the 3 days. We searched and searched, hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement, probably near 1,000 volunteers were searching everywhere. And I remember a news reporter coming to the house and saying, well, Mr. Walker, what are your feelings now that they found your daughter dead? That was the first we heard about it. Carla was severely beaten in the face, brutally raped, and she was choked to death.
For over 40 years, Carla's case remained unsolved, one of an estimated 200,000 cold case murders in the US. Murders that up until now, we thought would never be solved.
We had a lot of really wonderful detectives working on it, trying to move it forward. But, 4 decades, 44 years before it really got moving again.
The breakthrough came not in Carla's case, but in a case in 2018 on the west coast of America. A stunning investigation that threatens to revolutionize cold case murders across America using ancestry websites.
The Golden State Killer wore a ski mask.
The Golden State Killer was a serial murderer and rapist that terrorized California in the late 70s and early 80s. The police had plenty of DNA of the killer, however it didn't match to any DNA profiles in the FBI's database. One enterprising officer decided to run the DNA found at the murder scenes against DNA collected by an ancestry website. These sites are usually designed for people to find genetic relatives through DNA links, but the police realized that if they put the killer's DNA into the database, they might be able to find the murderer's relatives, a crucial clue. Most ancestry websites don't allow law enforcement checks, but a few do. The website the police chose to use was a company called GEDmatch.
So effectively what they're doing is building family trees. So you have to build back far enough till you reach what they call a most recent common ancestor, and then figure out where the trees came together, and then build forward from there. So by doing that, you're able to zero in on who the potential suspect is.
The capture of the Golden State Killer was a proof of concept moment. The technique worked. So could it be used to solve Carla's case?
You want to find hits that are within third cousins to make the case tractable. So we definitely had some that were within the third cousin range.
Othram was founded shortly after the Golden State Killer was identified, with a mission to solve unsolvable cases. The company's CEO, David Mittelman, says the first step in the process is to clean up the DNA, which is often degraded. In Carla's case, it was more than 40 years old. The company then sequences that DNA, looking at thousands of distinctive markers on the genome.
And in the traditional forensic DNA testing framework, like for CODIS, there's about 20 of these positions in the DNA that you're measuring. And that information can be used to confirm that you were at a crime scene or that someone closely related to you as a sibling, parent, or child was at a crime scene. And that's the extent of what you can do with 20 markers. What we do at Othram is we look at tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of markers. And with that information, we can detect more distant relationships.
Every time you test for DNA, you lose a bit of the sample in the process. In Carla's case, there was little of the killer's DNA left. It was likely this was the last roll of the dice.
we had to ask ourselves, have we seen enough DNA that is of this kind of quality and property to where we feel confident that there's a good chance we'll have a positive outcome? Otherwise, we don't want to do it, because when you test DNA, you're consuming it, and so you're destroying evidence.
Once they'd sequenced the killer's DNA, they ran it through several genealogy websites. From there, they created a family tree of the killer, and then began to look for possible suspects, the right age, male, who lived in Texas at the time of the murder. They developed a theory that the DNA found at the scene belonged to a man called Glenn McGurley, a man who lived close to Carla, a man who had previously been a suspect.
I know that he had had to drive up and down the road in front of this house thousands of times, probably had even stopped here. They knew who it was, but they had to do their due diligence as law enforcement to confirm. And that's what they did, and about 2 weeks later I got a phone call. We know exactly who it is. We're going to be arresting him.
Last month, McGurley pleaded guilty to the murder of Carla Walker. Some people, however, simply don't believe that ethically this technique should be used, worried that opening up people's DNA to law enforcement, people who aren't known criminals, could have worrying consequences.
Genetics isn't just any old tool for law enforcement. It's a particular and a potent tool, because it's not like a phone number that you just change when you get too many spam calls, or even a social security number that you might have reissued if somebody, takes yours. It's a technology that's in its infancy. We don't know yet what it will tell us, how well it will tell us things about people.
The big criticism of this technology is around consent. So after I get my DNA tested, I can go onto GEDmatch and I can upload my raw DNA files to the website. But here's the problem with that. I share DNA with my relatives, and critics argue that once I've uploaded my DNA and agreed to law enforcement checks, I am by association also opting in my entire extended family. And using my DNA, the police can link hundreds, perhaps even thousands of my genetic relatives to a crime, potentially none of whom have consented to be on a database used by the police.
I think the thing about people have to make the mind up in, you have two competing priorities here. The first priority is you have an absolute right to privacy. But on the same token, you have a competing priority, which is we have a right to not get murdered and raped. What amount of privacy are you willing to give up versus getting, the increased safety in society?
We hear about serial rape, we hear about serial murders, but less prominent are going to be cases that there might be more controversy about, whether it's using it in an immigration context or using it in a less serious crime context. We structured our society with suspicion-based reasons to intrude on people's privacy because we felt as a community that that was the right thing to do, even when it means that occasionally some crimes go unsolved. I think it is incredibly hard to say this. I don't mean to minimize or be dismissive of the claim, but we don't make policies about the civil liberties of our whole society based on the personal feelings of single victims or the needs of single victims.
After the apprehension arrest was made, I started to feel peace, P-E-A-C-E. I didn't realize for almost 4.5 decades, I had been geared up for a fight. We're not going to go away. We're going to find you. We're not going away. And thank God that day came.
Hello, it's time for your weekly tech news roundup. It was the week Google claimed it's Bing's most popular search term while appealing against antitrust fines from the European Union. YouTube is now removing videos containing vaccine misinformation for all currently approved vaccines, not just COVID-19. And California has passed a new law to stop workers being fired if they are not meeting productivity targets set by algorithms. It's had ears for a long time, now it has eyes. It's Amazon's new robot, Astro. The family-themed robot can be controlled remotely and features a periscope to see in high places. However, some critics have raised privacy concerns. Facebook has delayed releasing a version of Instagram for children after parents and experts raised safety concerns. This comes as recent research has increasingly shown how use of social media can affect the mental health of young people, with many under 13s already using Instagram. And finally, as China announces a complete ban on cryptocurrency, one hamster is busy raking in profits from its cage. Mr. Gox is currently outperforming the S&P 500, with a portfolio up by nearly 24% since June. The German rodent's crypto-rigged office lets him perform exercises that execute trades. Gives a whole new meaning to wheeling and dealing.
We've seen the power DNA can have in solving crime and the ethical dilemmas around that. Yet many are willing to give up a little saliva to get to know themselves better. DNA Nudge assesses customers' propensity for certain conditions, guiding them away from the foods that would also increase their risk.
If you've got the genes for hypertension, then salt is something you should be careful of. If you've got the genes for type 2 diabetes, saturated fat and sugar are your problem. So what we do is we relate those conditions or those genetic risks to those macronutrients in food.
Time to hand over my DNA, which I've been assured will be destroyed straight after it's been analysed.
Then we load that into the cartridge, and then we load the cartridge into one of the nudge boxes.
It looks like a coffee machine.
An hour later, I have my results.